So I'm Simon, and I was involved in this work with co-authors Elsa, Radu, Michel, and Carlos. And I was involved a lot, mostly with the qualitative aspects, the human study design. So that's very much the angle I'll be coming from here. So the domain name system, get rid of the cursor. Domain name system, the services that are beginning to filter malicious content and block known malicious domains, and this is being referred to generally as Protective DNS. And why this is becoming ever more important is there are government-level PDNS, Protective DNS schemes that are emerging of varying sorts. So it's not that there's a standard approach that's appearing. So there are some of these countries mentioned here where it'll be public organizations are expected to use it, or there are national level kind of for citizen services appearing as well. And it's not simply a case of, well, if there is Protective DNS, we can add it on and we get more security. Switching to government level PDNS can potentially also disadvantage existing security provisions as well. For instance, if internet service providers were doing some of this work, then it decreases their ability to monitor for threats. And ultimately for us, the question emerged, well, do enterprises want Protective DNS? It seemed we'd got this far without anyone asking this. And yet these commercial, strategic, national programs are moving ahead. So simply put, Protective DNS, your device may request a domain name, and the resolver in this case would have a list of malicious URLs, and if they match up, what you're requesting and what's in the list, it's blocked and you don't get to go there. The request is not safe and it's blocked. And so the moving parts of what we were looking at here was this functionality of filtering requests against a set of addresses, the security benefit as perceived by users and enterprises, and also who's managing this, and where the resolver is. So to get some sense of what's going on currently, two questions: what's the extent of adoption, and in particular, Protective DNS, and then what factors are encouraging or discouraging the adoption of PDNS between users and organizations, where organizations are in essence representing a collective of users. So there's a lot of studies as part of this work. So as I say, looking at actual adoption, looking at home users is what factors would affect their willingness to adopt a solution like this if it was offered, or flipping that around, if it was imposed from top down, for instance, in a national level scheme, would they be happy with it? Would it change anything they do? But also looking at real world adoption opportunities with a partner ISP. And there were also interviews with enterprises and with experts who are part of the community involved in talking around these emerging PDNS initiatives. So with the actual adoption study, we took measurements of DNS queries across 240 countries or territories. Home user adoption, there was a prolific survey with 300 users, thereabouts, across a number of countries. And the diagram I had earlier, we would explain PDNS to them, ask them about their own perceived vulnerability, their perceived skills. So getting a sense of like what utility do users see for this? Do they think they need it? How effective do they think it's going to be? And as I say, the comparable controls they think they already have, can they distinguish what this does and the other things do not? And who do they think should manage it? And similar questions for the customers of the ISP who were offered a protective service, and we got a sense of how they felt about that. And then for the enterprise adoption factors, we interviewed a dozen professionals who were responsible for managing threats to the organization with similar questions, asking about their awareness of Protective DNS and the perceived pros and cons, also as part of their organization strategy. And then the expert interviews, we spoke to 9 members of the RIPE DNS mailing list, and also got a sense of, because of course they've been around this for a while, what do they think of how it's going, where it's going, and what they see of users and enterprises as they approach this. So with the findings, with the AppNIC data, the DNS measurements, simply put, what is the extent of adoption? It's low. So it's not that everyone's using it. It's ranging from 0.8% to 2% across the regions that we measured as a kind of rate of adoption from the measurements we took. So it's not like this is suddenly jumped and it's everywhere. It is, as we say, emerging. So it's kind of, we're seeing it it's an opportune time to be looking at what the adoption is like. It's not that it's everywhere. So then moving to what factors are actually encouraging or discouraging the potential adoption of PDNS. First, looking at the users. So this survey of 300 people on Prolific, there were 120 or so participants hadn't heard of it, but were still positive about it, given the description we'd provided. And the factors that were key for whether they said they would adopt a service like this was their own perceived vulnerability and the perceived usefulness of the service, but also cost was coming in there as well. Like, what's the value? What am I getting from this? With this idea of almost the users who need the most protection should be the ones who recognize that this could be useful for them. And then the provider and who that could be has had the biggest role here. So 156, over half of the half of the participants thought their ISP should be the one providing it. Mainly as it seemed to be the logical choice. Well, or they're processing my queries anyway, they're looking after my internet. So it would seem like they're already well placed to be doing this. Whereas 100 thought that a commercial provider should be the one who provides a protective DNS service, because as with many other technologies, this belief that the market will keep them straight and make sure they behave. And very few thought that it should be their government. So almost the opposite, thinking, well, the government is going to be looking after us and won't be trying to profit from us too much. And the interviews with the internet service provider customers were similar. We saw low opt-in from the people we interviewed. And this was interesting because it was a belief that, well, I've got all these other controls, so what do I need this for? What I've got already suffices. I've got antivirus, I've got malware protection, things like that. But almost this caveat of, well, I trust the ISP to do it because they're capable of doing this and I trust them. And we see this we saw this coming up with the enterprise interviews as well, which I'm jumping to now. So with enterprises, it was interesting here because it wasn't just the capabilities of protective DNS for the organization that was seen as a benefit, but also it hooked in the organization to a global threat intelligence network of sorts. So it was that, well, we will all benefit from what's going on in other organizations and the intelligence that comes from the greater network. And it was seen as easy to implement by some, and of course, providing an extra layer of security. And again, cost came up for those who didn't already have it, whether it was effective, and it isn't, as I was implying earlier, it's not just, you just add this on and it's going to have a benefit. It's, does this actually fit with the infrastructure we have? Is this something we want to keep trying to maintain and look after? Because the concerns relate to transparency. What is it stopping that it shouldn't? What is it actually blocking or not? And again, the privacy issues with what's being done with the data and trust in the provider. And again, caveats about, well, it's good if it's free and we can configure it, but we'd need these value adds of the intelligence that we would get. And with the expert interviews, it was interesting here, there was kind of this call for home users to arm themselves with more knowledge of how Protective DNS works. So this implies there's this kind of burden of, like, you need to have a lot of expertise to know what you're doing with this thing, and to be able to keep the provider in check. So the fit's important as well for adoption, as the enterprise users mentioned. And again, also the utility, and does it actually fit with the threat model of things you're wanting to prevent? And there were concerns with, if it's a government provider, to whether governments would decide to block benign addresses. So it's not just blocking malicious addresses, but might they add extra sets of addresses on? So we saw across all of these groups that we engaged with that they're prioritizing the privacy of their requests, but trust and transparency were really important in the sense of being able to understand what's actually being done with their requests. But this, as the experts implied, requires a lot of knowledge and agency to be able to challenge what's being done. And the role is critical of who the provider is. Users were preferring ISPs, and PDNS could complement other controls, but it could be difficult to distinguish what it's providing that other controls are not. And just to close, it could be that we move past this with governments subsidizing ISPs to provide the service, or the actual block lists, not necessarily the service, but the block lists are provided to organizations so that they can manage this in more locally. Thank you.